He was the greatest warrior of his time. Undefeated in battle, feared across Europe, and trained from childhood to rule a kingdom. As the eldest son of King Edward III, everything about his life pointed toward the crown, but fate had other plans. His early death didn't just remove a powerful heir, it left England in the hands of a child king, opened the door to rebellion, and set off a chain reaction that led to civil war and the fall of a dynasty. This is the story of the man history remembers as the Black Prince, and how one death changed England forever. Edward of Woodstock was born on June the 15th, 1330, at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire. His birth was a major event in the kingdom, as he was the first son of King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. From the beginning, there was no doubt about his future. He was born to rule. In a time when royal succession could shape the entire fate of a nation, his arrival gave England a clear heir to the throne. Because he was the king's eldest son, Edward was given important titles almost from birth. At just 2 years old, he became the Earl of Chester. A few years later, he was made the Duke of Cornwall, the first person in English history to receive a ducal title. When he was 13, he was named Prince of Wales, a title traditionally reserved for the heir to the English throne. These titles were public signs that young Edward was being prepared for kingship and would one day take his father's place as ruler of England. Even during his childhood, Edward was trained for leadership in both government and war. He joined his father at court and learned how royal decisions were made. He watched how power worked and how kings ruled over land and people. He was also trained as a knight, following the strict code of chivalry that shaped noble life during the Middle Ages. By the time Edward was a teenager, he was already involved in the affairs of the realm. In fact, when King Edward III left England for military campaigns abroad, his son was sometimes named Custos Angliae, which means Guardian of England. This meant that even at a very young age, Edward had a role in protecting and overseeing the kingdom when his father was away. These early responsibilities were signs of the trust and expectations placed on him. Everyone believed he would be the next king. But history, as we know, does not always follow the plan. In the summer of 1346, when Edward was just 16 years old, he joined his father on a major military expedition to France. England and France were locked in a long, brutal conflict known as the 100 Years' War. The king's plan was bold. He would land in Normandy, march across northern France, and confront the French army head-on. For the young prince, this would be his first real experience of war, and it would come sooner and harder than anyone expected. On August 26, 1346, the English army faced the French at the Battle of Crécy. The French force was much larger. They had thousands of heavily armoured knights, many on horseback, and were confident they would crush the English. But the English had a secret weapon, the longbow. English archers, well-trained and positioned on higher ground, launched wave after wave of arrows that tore through the French ranks. It was one of the first major battles in Europe where long-range weapons proved more effective than cavalry. Prince Edward fought bravely in the battle, even though he was still a teenager. At one point, the fighting became so intense around him that messengers were sent back to the king to ask for help, but King Edward refused to send reinforcements. He is said to have replied that his son should earn his honour on the battlefield. Edward stood his ground and survived the battle, helping lead England to a stunning victory. It was a turning point in the war, and the prince's courage was noticed across Europe. These victories didn't just shape the course of the war, they cemented Edward's reputation as a military genius. His use of terrain, discipline, and longbowmen showed a deep understanding of both strategy and psychology. Soldiers followed him not because they had to, but because they believed in him. He inspired a kind of loyalty few medieval leaders could match. From that day forward, he was a proven commander. Over the next decade, Edward continued to fight alongside his father in France. He developed a reputation as a strong and skilled leader who inspired loyalty in his troops. But his next great victory would take place 10 years later, and it would be even more important than Crécy. In 1356, during the long and bitter conflict known as the 100 Years' War, Edward was deep in enemy territory. With about 6,000 men, he had spent months riding across the French countryside in a chevauchée, a fast, destructive raid meant to weaken the enemy by burning crops, capturing towns, and stealing supplies. His men were tired but well fed and loaded with loot as they moved towards the city of Poitiers. But the French were ready to strike back. King John II of France rushed south with a powerful army, perhaps 15,000 troops, more than double Edward's force. The French king was determined to trap the English and crush them in one blow. Edward realised he could not outrun the larger army, so he chose to stand and fight. On the morning of September 19th, near the village of Noailles, just south of Poitiers, he set up his defences on a small ridge. The land around him gave him an advantage: thick hedges, a sunken road, and narrow paths that would slow down attackers. He made a smart decision. His knights would fight on foot, side by side with his best longbowmen, who were famous for their deadly arrows. Behind a nearby hill, he hid 300 mounted soldiers, ready to spring into action at the right moment. The French attacked in waves. First came the cavalry, led by the Dauphin, the king's eldest son. The charge was brave, but the English longbowmen let loose with a storm of arrows. Horses fell, knights were thrown to the ground, and their narrow path turned into a trap. Next came another wave, led by the Duke of Orleans, but they too got stuck in the same bottleneck. Their attack slowed down and fell apart, especially after running into sharp wooden stakes and caltrops, spiked metal balls meant to injure horses and feet. That's when Edward saw his chance. He gave the order, and his hidden cavalry burst out from behind the hill, charging downhill into the side of the French army. It was a surprise attack, a hammer blow that broke their morale. Many French soldiers began to flee. Some fought bravely, but the English were in control. Even though they were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, Edward's forces held firm. His clever planning, use of terrain, and perfect timing turned what should have been a desperate last stand into a brilliant and shocking victory. And then, in the middle of the battlefield, King John of France made his last stand, bravely fighting alongside his 14-year-old son Philip. Surrounded and refusing to run, he was finally captured by a Gascon squire named Denis de Mourbec and led away to Edward's tent. Capturing a monarch in battle was extremely rare, and it shocked the entire continent. Edward treated King John with respect, even inviting him to dine at his table. The French king was later taken to London, where he remained in captivity for several years before a ransom was paid. The capture of a reigning king by a prince barely in his 20s was a political earthquake. European courts took notice. Edward was not just a commander, he was emerging as a power in his own right, someone who could shape kingdoms through action and diplomacy. After Poitiers, Edward's status in both England and France continued to grow. In 1362, he was granted control over the region of Aquitaine in southwestern France, which included the strategically important Duchy of Gascony. This was a vast and wealthy territory, and he ruled it as Prince of Aquitaine, with his wife, Joan of Kent. As Prince of Aquitaine, Edward ruled not only with military strength, but with a sense of justice and diplomacy. His court in Bordeaux became known for its elegance and fairness. He listened to grievances, respected local customs, and sought to govern through consensus. These were rare qualities in an age of iron-fisted rule. At this point in his life, Edward had everything: power, wealth, fame, and a clear path to the throne. But with that power came new challenges. As his influence spread across France, so did resentment. He made enemies among local nobles and French loyalists, many of whom never accepted English control. Conflict would follow soon, but by then something else had started to go wrong, something that no armour or army could protect him from. By the mid-1360s, Edward, Prince of Aquitaine, was one of the most respected military leaders in Europe. In 1366, a crisis erupted in Castile, a powerful kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula. King Pedro I of Castile, known to some as Pedro the Cruel, had been overthrown by his half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Pedro fled and turned to Edward for help. In return for military support, Pedro promised Edward vast payments and political support. Edward agreed and led an English and Gascon army across the Pyrenees in the winter of 1367 to restore Pedro to the throne. This became known as the Castilian Campaign, and it reached its climax at the Battle of Nájera in April 1367. Edward commanded an army that included English longbowmen, Gascon knights, and even Portuguese allies. On the opposing side stood Henry's forces, supported by experienced French mercenaries. The battle was fierce but short. Edward's tactics and superior organisation won the day. Henry fled the battlefield, and King Pedro regained his throne. At first, the victory seemed complete. Edward had once again proven himself as a master of war. However, beneath the surface, the cost of the campaign was already taking its toll. The Castilian countryside was dry, the march was exhausting, and food supplies were poor. Disease spread rapidly through the army, especially among Edward's men, who were unfamiliar with the Spanish climate and living conditions. Edward himself fell ill not long after the campaign. He returned to Aquitaine physically weakened and never fully recovered. Many historians now believe this was the beginning of the illness that would define the rest of his life. What appeared at first to be another glorious military success had quietly marked a turning point, not just in Edward's health, but in his future. By this point, Edward had achieved more in his lifetime than most kings. He had defeated France's greatest armies, ruled a major duchy, and negotiated with monarchs across Europe. Many in England believed he would not just inherit the crown, he would elevate it. He was widely seen as a perfect blend of chivalric virtue, battlefield valour, and political intelligence. If any prince was destined to be a great king, it was him. When Edward came back from Spain, it was not the same. He suffered repeated bouts of illness that would rise and fall without warning. He often experienced fevers, fatigue, and severe pain. Sometimes he could barely walk and had to be carried in a litter by servants. Despite this, he continued trying to govern and command, determined to fulfill the role expected of him. Historians have debated the cause for his illness for centuries. Many early accounts suggested chronic dysentery, especially the amoebic type, which was common in medieval Europe and could cause long-term damage to the intestines and other organs. However, modern researchers have proposed other possibilities. Some believe he may have contracted malaria, which fits the symptoms of relapsing fever, weakness, and eventual decline. Others suggest brucellosis, a disease caught from eating unpasteurized dairy or uncooked meat, food often reserved for nobles on campaign. Brucellosis causes fatigue, joint pain, and recurring illness. Another theory is inflammatory bowel disease, which could explain the constant digestive issues and physical deterioration. Some even believe he may have suffered kidney damage, liver problems, or complications from typhoid-related infections. He was likely treated with purging and bloodletting, the common remedies of the time, which may have made his condition worse. Despite the severity of his illness, Edward refused to step away from leadership. He still expected to command, to govern, and to defend English interests in France. But the people around him could see that his strength was fading. His time in Aquitaine became more difficult. His earlier popularity faded as he raised taxes to fund military campaigns and maintain his household. Locals resented his rule, and tensions rose. By 1370, Edward was gravely ill, but a new crisis pulled him back into action. That year, the city of Limoges, which had once been under his control, turned against him. The Bishop of Limoges, a man Edward had trusted, opened the gates to French forces and allowed them to occupy the city. This betrayal came at a moment when Edward was already weakened, both physically and politically. Still, he prepared for war. Edward ordered his army to march on Limoges. Though too sick to ride, he was carried on a litter to the front lines. The city was retaken in October 1370 after a brutal siege. However, the aftermath became one of the darkest moments of his career. One chronicler wrote that Edward's forces killed 3,000 civilians during the assault. Modern historians now believe the number was much smaller, likely around 300, but in a single medieval town, even that was a terrible loss of life. The siege of Limoges marked a sharp break from Edward's earlier reputation for chivalry and restraint. Some believe it was this act that led later writers to call him the Black Prince, though that nickname would not appear in print until more than a century after his death. Others argue the name came from his armour or his coat of arms, which featured dark colours and the motto Ich diene, meaning I serve. Whatever the origin, this siege, carried out while he was sick and struggling, added a grim layer to his legacy. What had once been a story of triumph had now shifted. Edward of Woodstock, once the greatest knight of his age, was now known more for the burdens he carried than the battles he won. And as his illness deepened, the future of England grew more uncertain. By 1376, Edward of Woodstock, once known across Europe for his victories and leadership, was a shadow of the warrior he had been. His health had continued to decline since the Castilian campaign nearly a decade earlier. He could no longer ride into battle, and often could not even walk without help. Although he still held titles and influence, it was clear that his days were numbered. In the spring of that year, Edward knew the end was near. He had fought illness for nearly 9 years and outlived the expectations of many, but his body could no longer keep up. He had grown weaker and thinner, and some reports say he had spent his final weeks in near constant pain. Despite this, he took careful steps to plan what would happen after his death. He gave specific instructions for his burial and the inscription on his tomb. He wanted to be remembered not just as a prince and soldier, but as a man who understood that death comes to all, no matter how powerful. Edward died on June 8, 1376, at Westminster Palace. He was 45 years old. His death came as a shock to many, not just because he was a beloved public figure, but because of the timing. His father, King Edward III, was still alive, and this meant that the crown would never pass to him. Instead, it would now pass directly to his son, a child who had barely begun to understand the duties of a ruler. That child was Richard of Bordeaux, Edward's second son, born in 1367. His older brother had died of plague as a young child, and Richard was now the only surviving male heir in Edward's line. Just 1 year after Edward's death, King Edward III died in 1377, and the crown passed directly to the 10-year-old Richard. This created a major problem. England now had a child on the throne, with no experience in leading men, handling politics, or making decisions in times of war or crisis. Richard had grown up in Aquitaine, was raised in luxury, far from the practical demands of English court life. He had not been prepared to rule so soon, and many of the kingdom's most powerful nobles saw him as a weak figure they could influence or control. This moment marked a turning point not just in the fate of one family, but in the future of the entire kingdom. For the first time in generations, England's throne was held by someone too young to command it, and the cracks beneath the surface were about to widen. After Edward of Woodstock's death, the English crown passed not to him, but to his 10-year-old son Richard II. A child on the throne meant power shifted into the hands of noble advisors. England, already weakened by the 100 Years' War and the Black Death, needed strong leadership, but Richard was no warrior king like his father. As he grew, Richard tried to assert himself, but often made poor choices. He favoured a tight inner circle of advisors, alienating powerful nobles. Tensions boiled over in 1381 with the Peasants' Revolt, a mass uprising driven by high taxes and social unrest. Though Richard diffused the revolt, the king's instability was clear. In 1387, the Lords Appellant, a group of angry nobles, took control and executed Richard's allies. Though humiliated, Richard eventually regained power and struck back with a vengeance, ruling more like a tyrant than a king. His growing paranoia and disregard for noble rights culminated in a bold misstep. He exiled his cousin Henry Bolingbroke and seized his inheritance. Henry returned in 1399, claiming only what was his, but with widespread support, he deposed Richard and took the throne as Henry IV. Richard died soon after, likely murdered or starved in prison. Richard's fall shattered the direct royal line from Edward of Woodstock. Competing branches of Edward III's family now vied for the throne, launching the Wars of the Roses, a brutal dynastic struggle between the houses of Lancaster and York that would tear England apart for decades. It was a century of kings lost, crowns stolen, and chaos unchecked, and it all began with one death, that of a prince who never became king. What do you think? If Edward had become king, would history have looked the same? Would England still have had civil wars, or might the Tudors never have ruled at all? Tell us your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that change the world.